that was the song by Prince for Baltimore and Freddie Gray. And on the line, we have with us Mauri Saalakhan from the Peace Through Justice Foundation, and you were part of the Jeff Mauri. Mauri, are you there?
I am here, yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Can you tell us about the conference over the weekend in Secaucus, New Jersey, that you spoke at?
Yes, it was the UNAC conference, the United National Anti-War Coalition. And it's a coalition comprised of many different organizations, anti-war organizations, civil liberties, peace groups. I mean, it's a nice potpourri of different groups concerned about peace and justice issues. And it was a conference that began on Friday evening with a welcoming session, and it ended on Sunday. And there were many speakers, many very good speakers, inspiring, informational. A lot of issues were discussed, and among those issues were some of the political imprisonment cases that many of the groups are concerned with, like the case of Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui.
Right, so you spoke about AAFIA Siddiqui, who's a political prisoner who's been tortured by the United States, picked up in the U.S. and taken to Afghanistan.
Actually, she was picked up when she went back home to Pakistan. She was actually, she had spent 12 years in the United States as a student. She graduated from MIT and Brandeis University. And then in 2002, after 12 very fruitful years in the U.S., she went back to her home country of Pakistan. And she, in March of 2003, she got into a taxi cab with her 3 young children, ages 6, 4, and 6 months. And they were disappeared by Pakistani and American agents in Karachi, Pakistan. And then 5 years later, in 2008, she turns up in a weakened and disheveled state in Afghanistan. For 5 years, she was secretly held. We know that she was tortured. Her children were also held separately. And as the former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark has stated, this is the worst case of individual injustice he's ever seen. It is certainly the worst case of individual injustice I've ever seen.
And why did they pick her up?
AAFIA was targeted on the basis of suspicion. She was, because of her activism, I mean, she was a brilliant student. She graduated with honors from MIT and Brandeis universities in Boston. She was also a very deeply committed young Muslim woman with regard to the teaching of Islam as well as humanitarian relief work. And because of her activism, coupled with her academic brilliance, she became a person of suspicion after 9/11, when Muslim activists all over the country came under a cloud of suspicion. And that suspicion followed her back home. She was suspected of having ties to Al-Qaeda. And on the basis of that suspicion alone, she was targeted for rendition.
And what
as an individual, her case is like an individual manifestation of the Iraq War. The Iraq War was based upon suspicion, the suspicion that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which now we know, everyone knows, never existed.
Right, or even if they really suspected that they had it in the first place.
Right.
But Okay, so the morning of Thursday, September 23rd, 2010, Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui was sentenced to 86 years of imprisonment by a federal judge in New York City. The sentence imposed by the U.S. District Judge Richard M. Berman came as no surprise to this writer. This is off of your website, the Peace Through Justice Foundation website. I suspected the sentence to be harsh. That is precisely why in months leading up to this fateful day, we spoke about the need for a mass mobilization at the courthouse. I mean, like, what was the evidence? I mean, other than just having suspicions, I mean, don't they have to have some kind of, like, hard evidence?
Theoretically, the answer to that question is yes. In a democracy like the one that we claim to have in America, the government has the burden of proof. There's supposed to be a presumption of innocence until proven guilt based upon all of the evidence coming in. But we know that when it comes to socially or politically marginalized defendants, and AAFIA was clearly a politically marginalized defendant, the inverse rule is the case. Guilty until proven innocent. All of the evidence was in AAFIA's favor. All of it. And I'm not claiming this on the basis of something that I heard. I was in the courtroom for the trial, and I saw the evidence they introduced. I heard it all. All of the evidence was in AAFIA's favor, but it ended up being ignored by the jury because of the way AAFIA had been depicted in the media leading up to the trial, during the trial, and the way that the jurors had been manipulated with fear. And they basically ignored the evidence. They ignored the fact that the government star witnesses contradicted themselves under oath so much that they should have been charged with perjury. They ignored all of this and just found AAFIA guilty. And after she was found guilty, even though the case was not a terrorism case, and this is very important, it was not a terrorism case. The judge in the case, who was openly biased against AAFIA from start to finish, he applied enhancements, terrorism enhancements, that justified, in his mind, giving her a sentence of 86 years for attempted murder. This is the charge that she was tried for. She was accused of attempting to murder U.S. personnel in Afghanistan 5 years after she was disappeared and mysteriously turned up in Afghanistan, when they basically released her and set her up to be killed.
So they said that she tried to kill U.S. personnel in Afghanistan.
That's U.S. personnel, FBI soldiers, probably CIA. This is what she was charged with: attempted murder of U.S. personnel. They had to come up with something to justify.
Right.
To justify AAFIA being shot. AAFIA was shot. And so in order for them to cover up and to justify her being shot and to cover up the circumstance that resulted in her being shot, they claimed that while she was waiting to be reinterrogated, an American soldier laid his M4 rifle on the floor in the office area of the Afghan police commander, where AAFIA was being held and where she was awaiting reinterrogation. They claimed that one of the American soldiers laid his M4 rifle on the floor, and she came charging through the curtain where she was being held, behind which she was being held, picked up the rifle off of the floor, took the safety off of it, and fired it, attempting to murder U.S. personnel. So even though no one was shot but AAFIA, no one was shot but AAFIA, she was tried for attempted murder, and then on the basis of her being convicted for attempted murder, even though all the evidence was in her favor, and the Afghan police commander even signed a sworn affidavit that was introduced into the court proceedings by her defense attorney that, quote, the prisoner never touched a weapon, never fired a weapon. Despite that, she was successfully convicted of attempted murder of U.S. personnel and then given a sentence of 86 years. This is life without the possibility of parole, the type of sentence that even convicted murderers in America, in many, many cases, do not receive.
Where is she now?
She is on a military base in Fort Worth, Texas. FMC Carswell is the name of the institution. That's where she's being held in virtual solitary confinement. And it's been 7 years now that she's been back in the United States, confined, 5 years of secret imprisonment before that, a total of 12 years now that AAFIA has been wrongfully imprisoned.
I mean, has anyone seen her? Has anybody been able to visit her?
This visitation is very difficult, even by phone, even telephone visitation. Her family has not had any communication with her for almost a year.
And what is she?
And when last year, when the former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, the highest law enforcement office in the land, when he attempted to visit AAFIA and Lynn Stewart, because Lynn was being held at the same institution last year, the authorities at FMC Carswell allowed him to visit Lynn Stewart, but he was not allowed to visit AAFIA.
Yeah, they were probably afraid of what he was going to find. She was, I mean, like, does anybody know what kind of condition she's in?
We know that the conditions violate the U.S. Constitution's guarantee against cruel and unusual punishment. We know that for a fact. And right now we have been pressuring to try to get the U.S. government, and specifically the Department of the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, to allow an independent medical team into FMC Carswell to examine her so that we can determine what the exact state of her physical and mental health is.
Because, I mean, she was not treated so well when she was held in Bahrain, I believe it was.
And in Afghanistan, that's what she was. For those we don't know if it was for the entire 5 years because, again, she was secretly held. But we do know that for the latter part of that 5 years, at least for the latter part, if not for most of that 5 year period that she was disappeared, we know it was spent at the detention center in Afghanistan. We know that for a fact because 4 Arab Muslim men escaped from Bagram. They escaped from Bagram. And Bagram, like Abu Ghraib in Iraq and Guantanamo in Cuba, it is a detention center that was, up until recently, controlled by the Americans. AAFIA was under American jurisdiction as a prisoner, as a secretly held prisoner. And so we know that that's where she spent at least a portion of that time of disappearance. And in 2008, she was brought back to the United States, and she was held at a detention center in a maximum security detention center in New York City for about 18 months leading up to the trial. And there she was held under conditions that violated the Constitution's supposed guarantee against cruel and unusual punishment.
There's something that I read that was saying that she was made to be naked all the time and was raped constantly. Do you know?
We do know, yes, we do know that they did many things to AAFIA when she was a prisoner in Bagram to humiliate her, to attack her human dignity, to do psychological damage to her, especially as a Muslim woman who covered her body completely prior to being taken into custody as a political prisoner. We do know that she was violated in many ways. The prisoners that were held at Bagram, those who have spoken about AAFIA, there are at least 2 prisoners that I know of who were at Bagram at the same time that AAFIA was. And they said that even though she was like a ghost prisoner, she was known as Prisoner 650. This was the number that she wore on her clothing at Bagram. She was 650. They said that she was like a ghost prisoner. They would only see her when she was being moved in the detention center or when they wanted to humiliate her before the other male guards and prisoners. But they would hear her haunting screams on a daily basis, both because of the anguish of not knowing where her children were and missing her children, as well as the things that were being done to her. She would only be seen from time to time when they wanted her to be seen, but they would hear her haunting screams daily.
Unbelievable. And how did you get involved in this? Can you just talk a little bit about yourself and your activism and how you got involved in this cause?
Yes. I have been a human rights advocate for about 25 years, maybe a little over 25 years for most of my adult life. In 2009, AAFIA was brought back to the U.S. in 2008. In 2009, about a year later, I delivered a speech at a large Islamic center in Baltimore, and to a few hundred people that were there. And after everything was over, we had a table in the lobby area with our books and various other materials on it. And a young woman walked up to me, a young Pakistani woman walked up to me and asked if I knew about the case of Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui. And I told her that I knew a little something, but not much. So she asked me if I would like to hear more, if I would like to know more. I said yes. And subsequent to that brief conversation, I met again with that young woman and her parents, her mother and father. And they walked me through the case of AAFIA, to what they knew about the case up until that time. And from there, I started doing some research immediately after that meeting. I started doing some research, and the more information I gathered on AAFIA, the more I realized this was one of the worst cases I had ever seen. It was a terrible injustice. And that's how I became involved. It was in 2009. And I've been involved ever since. And AAFIA's case has grown now for me as an individual and for us as a organizational entity to be coming probably the most important case that we're dealing with. You know, the lion's share. While we are involved in many other cases and issues, the lion's share of our time, energy, and limited resources going into AAFIA's case because we consider this to be a not only a huge precedent-setting case, it is a litmus test, I believe, for all of us. Those of us who become aware of who she is, of where she is, of how she got where she is. This is a litmus test for us. As I mentioned in my brief address at the UNEC conference this past weekend.
And who's representing her? I mean, who is, it seems as if, just from listening to you, like she doesn't have much representation.
Well, at this point, AAFIA's case, believe it or not, has been officially closed by Judge Richard Berman. He closed this case a few months back, claiming, and we don't believe this, in fact, it did happen. It is nothing more than a very graphic indication of how debilitated her mental state has become.
Oh, yeah.
He claims that AAFIA wrote a handwritten request for her case to be closed, that she had no confidence in the justice system of America, and she was just officially requesting that her case be closed. And of course, he rapidly, according to him, in response to that request, closed her case. And he said something that was very revealing when he announced the closure. He said that he probably, because the first rung of appeals has to come through the judge who presided over the case, he said that he probably would have decided against her anyway. So, this is a man who, again, was openly biased against AAFIA. He allowed his prejudices to, factor into the way that he presided over the case and his rulings. And now, at this point, with her case being officially closed, the only option that AAFIA has, the only possibility that she has for release, is through a political decision being made.
Did anybody ever, did anyone ever see this letter that she supposedly wrote saying she wanted her case closed? I mean, how do you know there is one?
Well, that's a very good question. And that's an issue that we are pursuing. Now, to get back to the question you asked about representation, there are two attorneys, two human rights-oriented attorneys that are in the process now of becoming officially on board in AAFIA's case. Steve Downs and Kathy Manley, two friends of mine who I have a lot of respect for and confidence in. During the trial, AAFIA had a team of well-seasoned attorneys, but unfortunately, her team of attorneys was being paid for by the Pakistani government, the same government that handed their citizen over, and there were strings attached to the money that was allocated by the Pakistani government for her defense. There were strings that were conscious or unconscious. And the bottom line was that it was not just my opinion, and the opinion of everyone I've spoken to, everyone who I've heard express an opinion about the trial and the defense. While the defense was adequate, it was not adequate enough. It was not vigorous enough for the type of trial that this was. They didn't push as hard as they could have and should have in representing her, in challenging, especially those government witnesses that contradicted themselves under oath. They should have gone after them with a fury, and they didn't.
Right.
They should have challenged some of the motions that this biased judge, on behest of this equally biased prosecution, put in place. They should have been more challenging to these issues, and they weren't. So,
So, right, you said the judge was biased, and and I've heard that a lot, especially in cases of Mr. Ray Hinton, who spent 30 years on death row and then was recently exonerated. That, right, like they're guilty, and seen as guilty, like right from the beginning, which is the exact opposite and in complete contradiction to what a judicial system is supposed to be about. I mean, a judge is not supposed to, already have his mind made up. I mean, that's what a hearing and trial is for.
That's right. A judge is supposed to be a neutral and objective arbiter
Right, like
of a process that is supposed to be geared toward identifying the facts, the truth, and establishing justice. But unfortunately, our judicial system, and especially when it comes to political cases, it functions far below that standard.
I mean, they sound, lazy. I mean, I would imagine, when you're a judge for over 10 years, whatever, between 10 and 20 years, or a lawyer or a police officer or whatever, I mean, you're doing this job for, a couple of decades. I mean, like after a while, it's like, I would imagine it's easy to just get lazy and, it just gets to a point where, that newness that maybe they had at the beginning is completely gone, and nobody sees it, and it's as if they're just right. They get away with just being completely like complacent in this job that they preside over someone else's life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, that's a part of it, and that's giving some of the judges the benefit of the doubt to simply say they get lazy, they get complacent. That's giving some the benefit of the doubt. With many of them.
But I mean, how do they
open hostility?
How do they get away with torturing people? I mean, I don't understand. Like, how do they get away with torturing people? I mean, this is outrageous. I mean,
yeah, I agree.
I mean, how is it that they're not being held accountable for torture?
But at the end of the day, we, all people, they get the type of leadership they deserve in all spheres of activity. When more American people become more consciously aware and consciously outraged and active and engaged in pushback to help this country live up to the better part of itself in all spheres of activity. Until that happens, we're going to continue to experience what we've been experiencing in the courts and in other spheres of activity. We get the leadership we deserve.
Right.
In a democracy, a democracy is supposed to be about the people, we the people, exerting influence, having a say.
The people,
in the direction of our country, in the direction of our nation, and how the government behaves, how the government conducts its business in our name. And when we just allow the government agencies to run roughshod over us, especially in terms of our rights, our constitutional rights, our human rights, if we just allow them to do this, then we are, in large part, we share the responsibility for that. More people have to wake up and get active.
I wanted to read off of a website for Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui that it's by her family, and it describes who she is. It says the case of AAFIA Siddiqui has brought with it a wave of emotion from all corners of the world. The detention of this woman and allegedly her children has evoked condemnation from politicians, lawyers, activists all over the world. In an environment where the abuses in the war on terror are becoming increasingly known, the case of Siddiqui stands as an anomaly within the new era of openness under the Obama administration. from the day of her initial detention, no information regarding AAFIA Siddiqui seems consistent, especially in relation to information released by the U.S. administration. Her various alleged persona can give the impression of an extremely high-level Al-Qaeda operative. However, at the same time, the statements of lawyers, family, and friends render her incapable of any act of terrorism. The purpose of this piece is to try to separate the facts of Siddiqui's life from the fiction, and as a result show that the lies that have been told about her are completely inconsistent with her treatment. Exposing the truth in the case of AAFIA Siddiqui is of the utmost importance to all those who believe in the value of due process and the rule of law. For 6 years, this mother of three has been placed through some of the most unimaginable forms of detention, all due to her religious convictions. It is now time for her to be released without charge and to be reunited with her children and repatriated back into Pakistan. Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui was detained in secret detention for 5 years in Bahrain, it says, and faced horrendous abuses there. She has now been transferred to the U.S. to face trial. Yes, so this was written a while ago. This report examines the lies and inconsistencies in the U.S. case against her. So it's called Cage Prisoners.
Oh yeah, yeah, Cage Prisoners. That's an organization out of the UK that has been doing phenomenal work around political imprisonment issues, post 9/11 especially, and in particular. And they recognize AAFIA as a political prisoner. The official website for AAFIA is AAFIAmovement.com. AAFIA, AAFIA movement.com. That's the official website out of Pakistan for AAFIA. And there's a lot of information up there on that website, including videos that folks can benefit tremendously from.
It said in 2003, I'm just going to read this short piece on the same website. AAFIA Siddiqui was once simply the daughter of an educated Muslim family, the little sister, student, young wife and mother, the MIT and Brandeis educated and idealistic woman who wanted to help her nation through educational reform. But by 2003, she had become the victim of an abusive and vindictive ex-husband and the victim of craven and greedy generals when her 6-year-old son, 4-year-old daughter, and the infant were kidnapped by agents of the military government and turned over to representatives of the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And then they had to come up with as I noted, 5 years later. That happened in March of 2003. And then 5 years later, they released her only because those 4 men that escaped from Bagram, who told stories about a woman being held there, secretly held there. As that word began to get out far and wide, people in the know began to put 2 and 2 together as they were describing her as a young Pakistani woman in her early to mid-30s who had lived for a number of years in the United States, who had been torn away from her children. People in the know began to put 2 and 2 together, and they began to exert pressure on the authorities, on the American authorities who controlled Bagram, on the Pakistani authorities because AAFIA is a Pakistani citizen, on the Afghan authorities because she was on Afghan territory, to admit that there was a woman being held there and then to identify who it was. It was then that they released AAFIA and then set her up to be killed. And then later, because she didn't die from that gunshot wound to the stomach, those gunshots to the stomach, because she didn't die, and she ended up on the insistence of the Afghan soldiers and police commander who were present when she was shot. On their insistence, she got medical treatment. After she was stabilized, she was brought back to the United States in violation of international law because she was an Afghan prisoner in violation of international law. They just brought her back to the U.S. and she's been here ever since. And then they charged her, and there's something here I'm going to read to you. I'm going to share with you that Cindy Sheehan said. That Cindy Sheehan is one of the most prominent anti-war activists in America. She had a son who was killed, who was
Right.
in the U.S. military, who was killed in the Iraq War, and that lit a fire under her. She said, quote, even if Dr. Siddiqui did shoot at the Americans, reflect on this. Say this case was being tried in Pakistan under similar circumstances for an American woman named Dr. Betty Brown, who was captured and repeatedly tortured and raped by the ISI. That's the Pakistani intelligence. Here in the States, that woman would be a hero if she shot at her captors, not demonized and taken away from her life and her children, end quote. And I agree.
I mean, like, I was actually going to say that before. I mean, because, I mean, even if, right, I mean, it's normal that she would try to defend herself after the way that she's been treated. I mean, it was like they're actually making her like that by the way that they're treating her. You know, I mean,
Right.
I just feel like we live in such a backwards country, especially when it comes to the judicial system, because I've been hearing so many situations like this over and over where this country does everything backwards. You know, they take a person who's, you know, suspected of being guilty of something. They never actually prove it. They detain them, they imprison them, torture them, convict them, and all of that, all the while making them into the guilty person that they had wanted them to be all along.
That's right.
It's like they do it backwards.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
And that is something that should have all of us who believe in the so-called quote-unquote rule of law, all of us who believe in the Constitution and in constitutional rights, all of us who believe in human rights, you know, that should be a cause of concern for all of us. Because as Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
I wanted to, under the umbrella of, just indefinite detentions. I mean, she was convicted. The case is that, now they're saying is closed. But there's just so many, cases with similar details of AAFIA Siddiqui where, people, I mean, like, Freddie Gray, like what's going on in Baltimore. And now I emailed you, saying that this would be maybe a topic we could discuss with the attorney for the Baltimore Police Union. They want to have Prosecutor Mosby removed, claiming that there's a conflict of interest and saying, the officers did nothing wrong and how the officers didn't get a fair, I mean, it's not even like that they even had a trial, that they weren't treated fairly, that there's a rush to judgment against them. Instead of, like, that's exactly what this guy should be saying against Freddie Gray, that the officers did to Freddie Gray. I mean, these people, like, just blatantly live by, one set of rules for them and, like, just blatantly another set of rules for everyone else. And it's just out in the open.
I agree. I agree. What we see in the Baltimore case is, and there's a tremendous amount of irony in the Baltimore case, given the fact that the young prosecutor, an African-American female, she comes from a law enforcement family.
Right.
She comes from a law enforcement family. And as quiet as it's been kept in certain circles, when she ran for the office of the state's attorney, she got the support of the police union. She had the support, the endorsement of the police union, because she came she comes from a law enforcement family. And they just thought that by endorsing her, that if she won, which she did, they would be able to have more of the same, maintaining a very corrupt status quo with a black face on it. But and now they're shocked that that will not be the case. And now the very same individual that they endorsed for that office, they want her to recuse herself now, bring in an independent prosecutor because they don't like the decision that she's made up until this point.
I mean, right, like
it's simply a decision to hold the police officers who have taken an oath to protect and serve, hold them to the same standards of accountability as every average, everyday citizen.
I mean, it's real. I mean, like sometimes, like I really feel like we're living in the Twilight Zone because I mean, it's right, like there in your face. I mean, this Mike Davies, attorney for the Baltimore Police Department, is like giving this press conference and saying these officers did nothing wrong, and it's like, I mean, okay, so like. Freddie Gray is dead. Like, what do you mean they did nothing wrong? He died, I mean, well, a week later, but I mean, he was completely injured in their custody. So,
that's right.
obviously, they did something wrong.
Neck,
right.
A severed spine.
80%.
And yet they claim they did nothing wrong.
Well, I mean, like, these people are delirious. I mean, like, where's the mental hygiene in the world? I mean... It just, come on. I mean, like, how more, like, idiotic is it? Are we going to allow, how much more blatantly idiotic and insulting and just the denial of reality right in your face? Are we going to allow people to just, to take things? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, they're like, they are the clear criminals that, of course, like they just want to be able to do whatever the hell they want. I mean, naturally, there's no justice system. It's a for-profit justice system, for-profit prison system. I mean, that's pretty much been established. Like Loretta Lynch is looking, calling for this investigation. She gave a press conference and about the police abuses in Baltimore. I mean, they've been going on for so long. I mean, things have been going on for so long, and they've been getting away with things for so long. That's the problem. And, once they've gotten away with it for so long, and then you try to take that away from them, it's going to be that much harder now.
That's true.
I mean, do you like, what do you see happening in Baltimore as far as, because they're also saying like, oh, the police are like afraid to do their jobs now. And I'm like, well, that's kind of a good thing if their job is to just violate people's rights.
I believe that and if this happens, it's going to be not only unfortunate, but it's going to raise the communal ire of the people of Baltimore, the citizens of Baltimore, if this happens. But I would not be surprised if the efforts that are being made right now by the defenders and advocates of the police who have been accused of this young man's killing, their attempts to get a change of venue. I believe there's a very good chance that they may be successful in getting a change of venue. And if they do get a change of venue, I don't think the prosecutor will prevail in this case. I believe that these men will probably get off. And I also believe that if the facts are allowed to surface in a moderately fair process, I believe that the discovery will be that the serious injury that was done to this young man was done when he was arrested. It wasn't done. It wasn't as a result of the ride. It was a injury. It may have been further aggravated by the ride,
right.
but the injury itself took place
on the sidewalk,
either accidentally or intentionally when he was arrested. At the time that he was arrested, that's when that injury took place.
Right on the.
That's what I believe,
yeah.
And I believe that that the forensics will ultimately prove this out. But again, if they get a change of venue for this trial, those officers are going to probably be found not guilty. And it's going to escalate the tensions already existing there in the Baltimore area.
I mean, the bottom line is that, right, I mean, they're just going to keep pushing everything until they get things the way that they want it to be. I mean, reality and facts are just meaningless in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it's it's whoever is just like more of the bully and who's just going to keep pushing things to get what they want, and that's the Baltimore Police Union and whoever else. I mean, it's really, I mean, they're gonna probably end up calling the National Guard back to Baltimore because, I mean, the uprisings are gonna probably come back again. So
yes, that's true.
Are there any other cases that you're working on? We have like 5 minutes.
There's so many cases.
You were in Pakistan last year. You visited with AAFIA Siddiqui's family last year.
Yes, I was in Pakistan for 9 very intensive days. I arrived in Karachi. I traveled within Karachi. I traveled in Lahore, another major city. I traveled in the capital, Islamabad. And before I left, we went all the way up into the northwestern territory of Peshawar, which is right near the Afghan border. I got to admit that was the only time when I felt, a bit of insecurity for my person. Because when I was up in Peshawar, I looked up into the sky and I knew somewhere up there in that sky there was a drone that was beaming down on, the activity that was taking place down in the marketplace, where all of these people had gathered together to show their support for AAFIA. But yeah, I had a very, very, very intensive 9 days in Pakistan, and everywhere I went, all of the people from the lowest of the low to those who are considered to be the quote-unquote leaders of the country and the political sphere and in the media sphere, in the business sphere, everywhere I went, all of the people, they just felt passionately about AAFIA Siddiqui and wanting her back. She was the daughter of the nation that they wanted returned back to her homeland. It was just an amazing journey. But getting to your question, back to your question about the other cases,
okay.
We have been involved for some time now, for a number of years, in the growing number of cases involving up until recently, they have all been predominantly young Muslim males targeted post 9/11 for quote-unquote terrorism conspiracies. Conspiracies that more often than not are engineered by informants and agent provocateurs working for the FBI. So we've been involved in cases like that unfortunately, very regrettably, and to my horror, are now beginning to touch upon young Muslim women as well. It's very sad, but we've been involved in these kinds of cases for years, like the case of the Duca brothers. I don't know if you were in you were present in the session, I believe, but I don't know if you recall hearing about the Duca family out of New Jersey, where they had three. This is an Albanian family, an Albanian Muslim family who have been in the U.S. for many years. They started a very successful roofing business in the Cherry Hill area of New Jersey. Very conscious, good people, salt of the earth kind of folk, who were contributors to their society. They had three of their sons. Out of their four sons, they had three of their sons taken. And they're now imprisoned under life sentences for, according to the government, aspirational offenses, things that they wanted to do, according to the government, but didn't do.
I mean, how ridiculous is that?
Yeah, it is. It is.
I like to quote Bill Binney over and over and over again, because I interviewed him twice on this show, and I kind of knew this already, and it's basically been out already, but as far as like other things go, like the Justice Department and things like that, but he said it about the NSA, and how they get more money when things are going bad. So the NSA is not, everything is backwards. People need to realize that everything in this country is backwards, and that money is used and people get paid. That's what everything is about, is getting the money. And so they perpetuate terrorism. They perpetuate criminals because they get more money.
Yeah, that's right.
And
what is that expression, follow the money?
I mean, people got to really let that sink in. So I want to thank you very much, Mauri Saalakhan, from the Peace Through Justice Foundation, and that's your website, the peacethroughjusticefoundation.com, and all the information on Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui can be found. 2014 International Mobilization for Dr. AAFIA Siddiqui official statement, and there's plenty of links that people can find out more. And thank you again, Mauri Saalakhan.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to joining you again sometime in the near future. God bless.
You too. Good night.
Good night.
I wanted to